glanced at it, but not taken an opportunity.
So what's happening tomorrow?
So there's different panels. I have it here. Show you. I won't be here tomorrow. I'll just be here today. There should be some interesting discussion. If I have internet.
Okay, great. There's no connection.
No, it doesn't seem to work.
I'm at the University of Florida.
Oh, great.
I'm actually also at the Atlantic Coast. And I took over the state of this.
Racking up lines.
That's right.
I'll go to my presentation. Yeah, so we have basically we have an office covering Czech and Slovakia. So we haven't just spent that much time traveling yet.
And so what's your mission here?
So we've been here since 1991. We've had young representation. And of course in 2022.
Who's funding this guy?
We have partly funded more of a partnership. In the past we funded it, but we had
What are you trying to achieve?
So we're basically enforcing law, right? So we're national legislation is defined.
So are you the citizen?
Hello.
Hello, hi.
Hi, John.
I think we met this morning over
Yes,
breakfast.
we did.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes, I
same with.
keep running into it.
Where is
I
it?
keep running into it.
Oh, well. I missed you at breakfast.
That's right.
He was there, I assure you.
I didn't see him. He gets up at 5
Get up
and
at
jogs
5.
around the block as he
I
likes to.
Oh my gosh, I didn't manage that today.
Yeah, you
I so I'm represent that forest journal. I work for UN refugee agency. I've been in Warsaw for almost 4 years. I've been with UNHCR most time. Totally fluent. So I can order a coffee. I can order a wine.
More than I can do.
But that's about it. Yes.
No, it's a difficult thing.
Oh, I'm addicted to it's I mean I recognize words and things and that's fine. I can get the general gist of the panel. I think about 20 different forms of the same verb sometimes. And the pronunciation is even the word Rzeszów, right?
Exactly.
RZ, it doesn't make sense.
I misspelled it.
Oh, I look back at my notes from when I first arrived, which was in 2022, so the start of the Ukraine, and just looking back at my notes, how I spelled Rzeszów, it's Jesjow or something, something like this. Yes. And where are you based?
Oh, I'm based in North Carolina.
Oh yes, yes, I saw you.
There's no Wilson Center.
No, that's not true.
Oh, come on. The guy guys in the truck.
There's an underground.
No, it's all
There's an
festival.
underground Wilson Center.
No, it's not true.
Underground.
No, they just actually they've appointed 6 or 7 fellows, and they have a few distinguished fellows like Phil Rieker. So it's actually they try to make an effort to scale it up again gradually. So there is a little center, but it's not as large as this.
Yes, yeah, I feel the same. Let's see.
See you later. Nice talk.
Nice to meet you. Yes. Hello.
What
Hi.
happened to you?
I broke a bone in my foot.
Oh no.
My heart goes out to you.
Masha Marukini.
Hi, I'm Klaus. Nice to
Masha
meet you.
Marukini.
Hello. Hi. Navisha.
This is yours. Thank you. Crutches here.
Oh, you're rocking the. Is it a cast or what is the boot?
Yes.
That's great.
Something that replaces the cast so I can move it for the shower.
Oh, good, good, good.
But the light here is strong, right?
It is great. Sorry, I feel like I'm on a TV show.
Yes.
Filming Friends.
More makeup.
Like on the stage.
Yeah, like stage makeup. I know. We're gonna look totally washed out in the pictures. This one is
Where are you from? Sorry.
UNHCR, the University.
And you're the university? I'm from America,
Croatia.
Croatia. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And who is speaking of the
I decided since I'm a professor here in human rights, so the basic is a little bit of theoretical approach to the current situation of human rights. I don't know if you know about the but you know that letter of 9 states and just now declaration. Yes. And the question, my question is actually just I'm not going to political dimension, but looking from the theoretical standpoint. So the question is like, can it impact I don't know, because
No, and it's super interesting because I've got to
Dobra, bo słuchaj, bo tak. Bo to mikrofon. Proszę teraz jest, jak oni później będą mówić, ja zrobiłem taki po przełączaniu slajd. Zrobiłem po prostu taki klip. No i
to say that if you look at the migration case, it has statistics like
Actually, that's always the case. If you look at the population of asylum seekers and Muslims that they are
Without
assigned.
presentation. Without presentation.
Am I getting sent to
I think I sent it.
And just take the microphone and talk, or you can stand up. You can use whatever you want. Public seat on there. There.
Sorry, we're gonna sink
There.
into this.
Okay.
My
Just
brain
somehow
works. Did you get my PowerPoint?
Yeah. What you gonna sit here?
I think it's better, yes.
And you're gonna use the
Yeah, the presenter. I want to go there, but it's hard for me to stand for this.
you wanna sit also, right?
Join me.
Right? I don't mind actually. I quite like standing when I'm presenting. I'll be sitting for the rest of it.
No, I like standing, and my brain
I
works
know,
better
but-
when I stand, but it's not possible at the moment.
I'll sit as well. Because then
It's gonna be like more.
The-
I'm
the-
gonna
the-
sit
the-
also there.
the ladies with the
I'm gonna sit there. You're gonna sit here. They're gonna want to stand up. I'm gonna moderate. So it's like, first I'm gonna introduce, I'm like, say, welcome on International Congress, and I'm gonna introduce our professors from universities, and our vice director will come here and will also open the Congress.
you so much.
Start the plenary panel. And first it is Professor then you, and after all speeches, they're gonna ask if they're gonna have any questions. They're gonna ask,
But probably they won't.
and we have like small discussion. If anyone has and that's it. And then we're gonna go outside to take
Questions usually come when you have a debate. Now when you have one presentation from different topics.
nice 20 minutes. And I'm gonna because we need to leave this aula like before 1 o'clock. So
We need to be on time.
and then photograph and then lunch, but lunch is the nearest building.
But I told your colleagues that I will, after this session, I will leave and then come back in the afternoon. So because they told me I need to sign some papers, so I told them to find me after the session.
After this session.
Yeah.
Like this.
Okay, great.
No, we have projects, so we have money.
Money is always good. Yeah. For me, and they managed to lose my luggage yesterday. And my husband was there. It was the first time in my life that I traveled without putting anything in my backpack. But luckily there was another flight that comes that was like to Vietnam. Yes, we got to here.
Good morning. I think we are ready to start the Congress. My name is Mira Malczyńska-Biały, and I'm a chair of the organizing committee of International Congress of Human Rights and the head of the Department on Human Rights at the Institute of Political Science and Security Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you at 6th International Congress of Human Rights at University of Rzeszów. The Congress is funded by the Regional Excellence Initiative project entitled Migrants from Ukraine in the Podkarpacie Voivodeship in 2024 to 2027. This year Congress is truly special. Our speakers come from 22 countries across 5 continents. They represent academia, international organizations, and non-government organizations. Such a great interest in Congress shows that human rights, security, migration, and current geopolitical challenges issues are universal and important. And of course, that you love Poland, University of Rzeszów, and us. From this place, I would like to welcome the authorities of University of Rzeszów, the Vice Rector of University of Rzeszów, Professor Janusz Pasterski, the Dean of Faculty of Social Science, University of Rzeszów, who is also the Chairman of the Scientific Committee, Professor Krzysztof Żarna, Deans of the Faculties of the University of Rzeszów, Professor Wojciech Czarny, Professor Bogdan Wierzbiński, Professor Paweł Grata, Professor Łukasz Cywicki, Professor Barbara Pełkala, And on behalf of the Professor Artur Mazur, General Dr. Marcin Żal, the Deputy Director of the Department of Civil Affairs and Foreigners at the Podkarpacie Voivodeship Office in Rzeszów, acting on behalf of Mrs. Teresa Kuba-Schul, the Podkarpacie Voivode, Mr. Dominik Łazarz, representative of the Provincial Police in Rzeszów, Paweł Międlar, representative of the regional branch of the Central Bureau for Combating Cybercrime in Rzeszów, Anna Dryniak, and Anna Wójcik. The academic staff, our panelists, the university and high school students, especially from high school number 9 in Rzeszów. Welcome in University of Rzeszów. I hope you're gonna come here for study, for not so far. We're very nice and we open. I believe that our discussion, both during the panels and informal conversation, will result in international cooperation and new research projects. Now I would like to invite the Vice Rector of University of Rzeszów, Professor Janusz Pasterski, to officially open the 6th International Congress of Human Rights.
Ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the academic community, public institutions, and civil society, distinguished guests, dear participants of the 6th International Congress of Human Rights, dear students. It is my great honor to open the 6th International Congress of Human Rights here in Rzeszów, an event that has become an important forum for dialogue, reflection, and shared responsibility for the foundations of a democratic society. Today, we gather to consider the challenges of our time and to explore how we can more effectively protect human dignity in a rapidly changing world. This year's Congress carries special significance for our academic community. The University of Rzeszów is celebrating its 25th anniversary, a milestone marking a quarter century of growth, commitment, and the building of an institution that not only educates, but also contributes meaningfully to public debate and to the development of our region and country. I am especially proud that this year's edition brings together representatives from more than 20 countries across 5 continents. Your presence here demonstrates that the conversation about human rights is truly global, and that Rzeszów has become a place where this conversation can flourish. I extend my sincere thanks to all organizers, speakers, and participants for your dedication in bringing this Congress to life. I wish you inspiring discussion, fruitful exchanges, and the courage to formulate new ideas that hopefully will have a real impact on shaping the future. It is with great pleasure that I declare the 6th International Congress of Human Rights in Rzeszów open. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for officially opening the Congress. We will now begin the plenary session entitled Human Rights, Geopolitical Tensions, War and International Security Challenges. I would like to introduce our special guest speakers who are sitting on the stage already. Professor Andrew Michta, Professor of Strategic Studies at the Hamilton School, University of Florida. Klaus Lares, Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Antonio Stango, President of the Italian Federation for Human Rights and Professor of International Organization and Human Rights at Rome Link University. There has been a change in the person representing the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Poland. Welcome, Mrs. Babić Routledge. Masza Marocini-Zriński, Professor and Head of the Institute for Human Rights, Faculty of Law in Rijeka, and President of the Constitutional Court of Republic of Croatia. Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for coming, for being here with us. So our speaker will now present their papers. After all presentation, there will be a time for discussion and for asking the question. So first, we can invite Professor Andrew Michta. The floor is yours. Whatever you want.
Okay. 30 minutes? 20 minutes. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Mira. I'm really grateful. Your Excellencies, this is a great honor. I've never been to Rzeszów before, so I'm also discovering how charming this city is and the region. I have spent some time when I worked with the Ukrainian military in the region because of the role that the region plays, but I've never been to Rzeszów before. So thank you for having me. I'm also very thrilled that I see so many of you, especially young people. When I come to conferences like this, I always fear I'll be saying thank you to both of you for coming, and we'll have to kind of leave quickly. What I want to do today is try to put what's happening in the international system as a context for the further discussion of human rights and the kind of threats that we see today, both in terms of individual citizenship, human dignity, and our ability to ensure security and safety of our people. Let me say the following. First, I would argue that we are in a period of protracted systemic instability. System transforming wars do not erupt because all of a sudden one actor begins to move against a country X. As I always tell my officers in the US, I say, look, the Second World War did not start because all of a sudden Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland in 1939. What you saw instead was regional balances that were imploding. You had the war in Manchuria, you had the Spanish Civil War, you had the Anschluss, you had the partitioning of Czechoslovakia, and finally at that point the system imploded. Why am I bringing this example from history? We're in a very similar situation today. We have 4 critical regional theaters that are barely holding on. I don't have to tell you because you're right next to Ukraine. We have a full-scale war in Eastern Europe. As of February 28th, we have a full-scale war in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. That is a second critical theater. Actually, the Middle East is almost like a subset of the European area of operations. I just returned recently from Korea, and I can tell you tensions that are rising on the Korean Peninsula, especially as the North Korean military rotates back from the Ukrainian front. Those who have survived, they come in with combat experience full of themselves, and especially since the Russians transferred missile technology to help the North Koreans launch their first satellites, there is growing tension. And the 8th U.S. Army that's there with the Republic of Korea military is not big enough to actually stop it. It may deter it, but it's only about 50,000 soldiers when you combine the American military and the Koreans assigned to it, plus the Korean armed forces. And finally, you have the Indo-Pacific. Why does it matter? Because up until about the early 1990s, the US military was structured to be able to fight two major theaters simultaneously and two secondary ones. During the Cold War, we spent, excuse me, approximately 6% of our GDP on defense on average. Last year was 3.2% of our GDP on defense. Our military, our joint force, which means all the services throughout the Cold War, were never below 2 million. Last year, we had a 1.3 million joint force altogether with recruitment shortfalls. That means there were probably closer to 1 million. The Russians are building an army of about 1.5 million. The People's Liberation Army in China is 2.5 million. The Chinese Navy is already numerically bigger than the US Navy, although the tonnage is smaller and it's not competent enough to challenge the US Navy. It's a very primitive force, but still the Chinese are building it up at speed and scale. We have an axis of dictatorships in the world: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. They're not connected by any value set. They're not connected by any sort of cultural links. It's the old traditional Machiavellian, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Russia is a quintessentially revisionist power in Europe. Putin is relitigating the end of the Cold War. He already controls Belarus. In effect, Belarusian armed forces are fully integrated with the Russian command and control system. So when you look at your border, Polish border with Belarus, you're actually looking at the border with Russia. Don't kid yourself, the Russians are there. Ukraine is the key, it's hanging in the balance. I'm a great admirer of what the Ukrainians have been able to do. And I'm very proud of my country, of the US, for supporting that effort, and also the Europeans. What I bemoan is a lack of strategy for Ukraine. We're in the 5th year of war, and there is no consensus on the end game, on the outcome in political terms. I will recall one of the less impressive leaders in Europe, Chancellor Scholz, who opined that Ukraine cannot lose, Russia cannot win. With all due respect, what kind of nonsense is that? This is not military planning. And the reason this is happening is because while Russia and China are mobilizing for war, the West is not. The West is still operating in the mindset that it used to be so nice when we lived in this globalized world. The United States has reduced its defense industrial base from about 51 major defense and space contractors we had in 1991 to 5 prime contractors we have today. Ask yourself why the Polish F-35 will finally arrive with great fanfare after 5 years, actually almost 6 since you signed the contract. There's no capability without capacity. We have offshored about 40% of American manufacturing to China. We built this monster. We took technology that took generations to develop across the West and handed it over to a 1.4 billion communist state and built an ideology of globalization around it, complex interdependence, middle class will rise in China, boom, Jeffersons will appear, and we will live happily ever after. History, after all, has ended. Don't you remember? Unipolar moment. The world was flat, and all this baloney that was being fed across American policy community, and unfortunately across the European policy community. So I'm here to ring the alarm. If those regional balances do not hold, bad things will happen. Europe, and now I'm going to really point a finger at you. Europe, over the last 30 years, took a vacation from history. Europe has disarmed, period. Europe has about 500 million people on the continent. If you include the Brits into it, it's even more. Europe is being terrorized by a country with only 140 million people, probably more like 130 million today, a pale shadow of the former Soviet Union. Remember, the Soviets sat in the middle of Germany, had 54 non-Soviet Warsaw Pact divisions at their disposals, had nuclear weapons that threatened everybody, whether you were in West Germany or you were in Portugal or Spain, you were in the same boat. This is a pale shadow of that Soviet Union, and yet the Europeans cannot generate sufficient capabilities to deter and, if need be, to defend. Every president I remember since the 1990s kept beating you over the head saying, please spend money on defense. In Madrid, you've agreed to 2% of GDP on defense. You never met it with a few very exceptional, wonderful countries such as Poland, such as Sweden, such as the Baltic states. Countries that are on the flank, they share the same threat perception. The tragedy of Europe is that unlike during the Cold War, the security optics has become regionalized, in part because Germany of today is a different country than it was during the Cold War. The Bonn Republic was a frontier state. It was quintessentially transatlanticist. It was a point of contact. The reason we have American legacy bases in Germany is because that's where it was at. That country today is Poland. You're the West Germany of that era. You're the point of contact. You're the hub of NATO defenses. And what you're doing is commendable, that you're spending on defense, you're lacking reserves, you don't have systems coordinations, you lack sensors, satellites, and the rest of it. But you, the Finns, the Swedes, the Balts, you're doing things. You understand the threat. Remember, I always tell my students, alliances are built based on two factors, shared threat perceptions and shared interest. So when I'm in Helsinki, I was recently in Tallinn, it's always Russia, Russia, Russia. When I'm in Berlin, no longer that's the case. Germany is no longer what the Bonn Republic was. It's a traditional Mitteleuropa state. It has buffers to the east. And for 16 years of the Merkel tenure as chancellor, it tried to manage its relations with Russia by using economic and political means, and it all blew up in their faces. They still have to come to terms with that foreign policy fiasco. I hope they will. When I'm in Paris, the French military tell me that the southern border of Europe is not on the Med, it's in the Sahel, it's in Africa. The French are partly ready to operate in a large-scale war on the continent, but they're looking south to their traditional interests. And when I end up in Portugal, I have no idea what these people are talking about. I hope there are no Portuguese in the audience other than migration. And my point is, there is no shared threat perception across the continent, and therefore there is no shared interest in taking the risk to deter and defend against Russia. And finally, the United States, because this is the biggest element of that whole puzzle, and I'll stop there, Mira. The United States is coming out of 2 decades of the so-called global war on terror. The name global war on terror had only 2 truthful words in it, the and on. It was never global, and I had no idea how you fight terror. It's like, Hitler invades Poland and we fight blitzkrieg. This is tactic. This is not the adversary. The shock of 9/11, I lost a friend in the North Tower too at the Pentagon, turned the nation in the direction we should have never turned. For 20 years, we chased jihadis over the mountains. We fought in the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. Last time I was in Afghanistan was in 2013, and I came back as depressed I could possibly be. Our elites imagine that we can go into a sectarian, clan-based society, 90% illiterate, I'm talking about Afghanistan, and democracy build, nation build. Nations and national security are not a seminar in graduate school. You don't understand the culture, you don't understand the language, you don't understand the history, you don't know what you're doing. People who gave us global war on terror could not probably put a coherent sentence in Arabic together, but they were going to transform the world. The cost of the global war on terror, anybody has any idea? $8 trillion. That's the estimate from the Watson Institute at Brown. $8 trillion. For that money, you could rebuild every interstate highway in the United States, every power line, every power grid. Buy each one of us here 7 cars and we would have change for dinner on top of everything else. The nation is tired. The Americans are exhausted. The fact that we have offshored a lot of our manufacturing and kept fighting these, I called scheduled wars for the past 20 years means that today, and this is the Donald Trump phenomenon, Trump is not the problem. Trump is a manifestation of what's happening in the American society. America wants some me time. What that means is that for NATO to hold, for security to hold, you have to do your job. There is no excuse why a wealthy continent like this should not provide the core of conventional defenses of NATO. Don't cook up, security armies of European Union. If you believe that's possible, I've got a Brooklyn Bridge I can sell you at a discount. without American nuclear umbrella, without American high-end enablers, and I'm saying this not because I'm a US citizen, I'm just telling you it will take Europe a decade to rebuild because of the neglect that the elites allowed to destroy the militaries. The Bundeswehr has about 50 tanks, half of it is drivable. Just a couple of examples. The British Army has on paper 70,000 troops. In reality, it's 40,000 plus 4,500 Gurkhas. Ammunition stocks in Europe are such that if you were to fight a large-scale conflict, you would run out within about a week and a half. It will take time. You have professional militaries, you don't have reserves, you don't have societal resilience. And again, I exclude countries like Finland. Poland has a lot of work to do, but it's trying to do it. The Balts are fully mobilized, but they're city-states. Sweden, Finland, this is the Northeast Corridor. This is the new hub of the alliance. So I'll conclude by saying there's a storm brewing in the Indo-Pacific. If we end up in a kinetic conflict with the Chinese, every asset the United States has, other than the high-end enablers, all of our naval assets will go there because American soldiers will be in combat. If you do not resource your military, the alliance will become hollowed out and your security will be compromised. And on this cheerful note, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. 12 minutes it was.
12 minutes.
So,
Gone on another
good
8.
time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I would ask next panelist to take a floor. The next panelist is Klaus Lares.
Good morning, everyone. I'm deeply impressed. The auditorium is totally packed. Thanks for coming. How is everyone? Doing okay? Good. It's also my first time here in Rzeszów, and I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me, and of course for the excellent organization. I'm based at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is America's oldest public university, established in 1793, and we are pretty large, with something like, for at least by American standards, with 32,000 students. And at UNC Chapel Hill, I run a lecture series and conversation series by Zoom with prominent speakers on international affairs. If you want to be on my mailing list, contact me, let me know, or give me your email address, and I'm happy to include you, and then we can also have our talks by Zoom into Poland and hopefully get many new fans. Today, I would like to talk about the role of human rights in America's and Europe's relations with China. And while I'm based in the United States, I will say something good about Europe, not just something negative. I would like to talk about 3 points, or make 3 points. First of all, what is the structure of geopolitical relations today? Then I would like to talk about what is the Western world's typical approach towards China regarding human rights, and then what is the situation right now. Let me begin with the geopolitical structure we find at the moment. And I think today there's a lot of talk about a multipolar world, an evolving multipolar world. In particular, China likes to talk about that. In my view, this is not correct. What we are seeing today is not really a multipolar world. We see a G2 world instead. And I would say we actually see a G2 and three-quarter world. There is 4 essential superpowers or great powers in the world which determine relations. That is the United States, that is China, that is to some extent Russia, and to some extent the European Union. Of course, China and the United States, or in reverse order, because in a way we still have a sort of unipolar world order, because the United States is still ahead in many areas, particularly in the military area, but also in economic terms. However, China is catching up very fast,
For example, the Chinese now have a bigger navy than the United States has, also in technology, AI, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology. The Chinese are rapidly catching up. They have not yet overtaken the United States, but that may well happen in the future. The jury is still out. So these G2 powers are clearly dominating the international system. And both countries together, I think they are far ahead of anyone else. Regarding Russia, and Russia is still a great power, mostly in terms of its military performance and its atomic performance and the possession of the nuclear bomb. And the European Union is also still a great power because the economic potential of the European Union, of the European continent, is still formidable despite the current crisis. I'm sure we will all get out of that crisis in due course. And also the European Union has a rising military capability. What we have just heard about the criticism of Europe's military is, of course, all quite justified, but Europe is doing an awful lot. Europe is actually supporting Ukraine much more thoroughly than the United States is, particularly in conventional terms, particularly in delivering military aid. But it is also correct that without the United States, the Ukraine war against Russia could not be fought. So these four powers, the United States, China, Russia, and the European Union, they really determine our world today. In terms of human rights, they also have a predominant influence on everyone else, how we deal with human rights. Like in a company, the atmosphere, the guidelines are coming from above. Like at a university, where the president really sets the tone, the atmosphere, and also the guidelines for research performance. I believe that also applies to these four countries regarding human rights. If there is no human rights consideration among the four leading powers in the world, then the rest will not pay much attention either. And I think today what we see is a neglect of human rights regarding the leading powers in the world. When you look at China, China executes a few thousand people every year, and it is a state secret. We really don't know how many people are being executed in China. That is, of course, very sad. It's not a sign of an observance of human rights. Also, China has a serious forced labor problem, particularly in Xinjiang, but also in Tibet as well, and also in other parts of the country. And in Xinjiang, there are other very sad, very terrible things happening, which some analysts refer to as genocidal activities. This is, of course, highly controversial, and it's very difficult to judge if you're not a Xinjiang expert, but there are things going on which means that the elimination or the attempt to restructure, reform, and eliminate an entire culture is clearly in process in Tibet and Xinjiang. That also is not very promising regarding human rights. When we look at the United States, also the United States executes quite a few people per year, not as many by any stretch of the imagination as China. In 2025, the United States executed around about 47 people in 11 states, and which in my view is way too many. Then the United States has not a forced labor problem, of course, but it has a human rights problem regarding immigration. The activities of ICE, particularly the methods applied by ICE in Minnesota and otherwise, this is not an observance of human rights. And there are many other issues in the United States which we could criticize, which are not really observing human rights in a proper way. Regarding Russia, I think, we don't really even need to talk about human rights in Russia. The many war crimes committed in Ukraine are absolutely terrible. The abduction of Ukrainian children is terrible. The incarceration, the poisoning of opposition politicians in Russia is absolutely horrible. All that, of course, spares us to talk or to take any notion about human rights in Russia seriously at the moment. In the European Union, the picture is much, much better. The European Union has no death penalty. As we know, you cannot be a member of the European Union if you have the death penalty. There's no forced labor issue in the European Union, despite what the Trump administration has tried to explain to us, that there is a forced labor problem in Europe. Some European countries, like Volkswagen, for example, they may rely on forced labor in Xinjiang, have factories in Xinjiang which use forced labor. That is not to be approved of, that is sad. However, that is not the policy of the German government or of the European Commission or of other European governments. This is private policies, but not governmental policy. And the European Union is in fact one of the norm setters regarding human rights in the world. And they are rightly quite proud of that. And I think they're quite successful. The only real major country, major organization of countries, major great power in the world, which is serious about human rights and really pushes European rights and cares about European human rights, that is the European Union. Thus, of the 2 3/4 great powers in the world, it is really only the European Union which pushes human rights. And that, of course, means overall human rights do not play a particularly strong role anymore in international relations at the moment. That brings me to my second point. How has the Western world dealt with human rights in China traditionally? And I think we have two approaches over the years, really since the 1980s and 1990s. That approach can be summarized firstly as appeasement and secondly as an indirect approach. Appeasement, a good example would be the reaction to the Tiananmen Square uprising in 1989. While that was deplored by many or almost all Western governments, including by the Bush administration in Washington, D.C., they were quickly overtures to China to make sure that relations would not be disturbed for any length of time. While sanctions were imposed, while Congress in the United States allowed Chinese students to overstay their visas or extend their visas so that they could continue to stay in the United States, in private, President Bush sent notes to the Chinese leadership, said he was sorry that he had to impose sanctions. He was sorry that he really had to react to the uprising in Tiananmen Square, but he really wanted to continue good relations with the Chinese leadership. Soon, his emissary, Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor, was sent to China to reassure the Chinese leadership not to break up relations, not to take America's reaction to the Tiananmen Square massacre too seriously. And then Henry Kissinger followed, I think, in September or October 1989, who assured the Chinese leadership of similar sentiments. And the same, in a way, applies also to the European Union. While sanctions were imposed, at the time the EEC still, sanctions were imposed, arms sales to China were stopped and an arms embargo was imposed, but also the European Union really wanted to not disrupt relations with the Chinese because of the uprising in Tiananmen Square. And ever since, really within a couple of years of the uprising, there was a lively discussion whether or not arms sales to China should be taken up again. That hasn't happened until the very day. We still don't sell arms to China, but that the discussion even took up again in 1990, 1991 indicates, of course, that no one wanted to have good economic, trade, and also geopolitical relations interrupted with China because of the Tiananmen Square uprising. And that brings me to that other approach which I mentioned, that is the indirect approach regarding human rights and China. And here a good example would be the policy of former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who was in office after all for 15, 16 years, so for a long time. When you look at her, and I really summarize that, I don't want to bore you too long with that, but when you look at her first 2 years in office, then she had a very open, very determined human rights policy and constantly mentioned human rights in her interaction with Chinese leaders and also other countries. Then she received in 2007, September 2007, she received the Dalai Lama in the Chancellery in Berlin. The Chinese reaction was forceful. They broke off all economic relations with Germany, all trade relations, all diplomatic relations. They did not talk to the German ambassador or to other German officials, and Berlin was shocked. And that went on for 3, 4, 5 months, and then overtures from Berlin assured that relations gradually were normalized again. But that system, that harsh reaction by China because of the visit of the Dalai Lama to Berlin was a shock to the system for the German government. They really feared that diplomatic and trade relations with China would be undermined for a very long time. And with a very great effort, they managed to reverse that again. And this also changed the policy of Angela Merkel. After 2007, she became much more careful in her relations with China, and she only mentioned human rights or dissenters or people who had clear difficulties in China in an indirect way, not in public, only behind closed doors. And that also led to some successes. She managed in 2018, when I myself was at the embassy, the German embassy in Beijing, she managed to get out Liu Sha, the wife of the Nobel Prize winner, and that indirect approach clearly had a success. The German embassy was very actively involved behind closed doors in order to convince the Chinese leadership to let her go to Germany for health reasons and allow her to exit the country. So that indirect approach has certain successes, but of course it only means that certain people, certain selected people benefited from it. It is not a wide-scale human rights approach regarding China in geopolitical or trade terms. And that brings me to my final and third point, and that would be the situation right now. And I can make that quite short, because at the moment human rights do not seem to play a role in relations with China at all. Occasionally what we see is that Xinjiang is mentioned in the public, sometimes by governments, but in a very indirect way. Even that really quite well-known happenings in Xinjiang are not really made much of an issue in geopolitical and trade relations with China. When President Trump recently went to see Xi Jinping in Beijing only a few weeks ago, he was asked whether he would talk about human rights. And he said, sure, of course I will. And afterwards he was asked what had happened regarding human rights. It really played a very marginal role. Apparently he mentioned the case of Jimmy Lai, the former Hong Kong newspaper publisher who has been suffering in prison for many years and is supposed to stay for many decades still, though he's already 78 years old. And he only said, well, we talked about it, but that's a tough one. And meaning, nothing really is going to happen regarding Jimmy Lai. And that also is the general approach we see today, because geopolitical relations are so difficult right now about the Indo-Pacific, regarding Taiwan, regarding China's support for Russia in the Ukraine war, and also the dependence on China in terms of trade relations has become so formidable that human rights play a totally marginal role. No one dares to even talk about human rights formally and officially to Chinese officials because they could take umbrage and break off relations or scale down trade relations with the Western world. Only today I read that China was displeased about some possible trade reaction by the European Union. The European Union, as you know, is suffering from an overcapacity by China and an export drive by China into European countries, and the Chinese decided to break off and cancel 2 scheduled meetings in Beijing because they were displeased by talk within the European Union about a reaction to contain that export drive to Europe by Chinese companies and by the Chinese state. If in trade relations they really are very scared to annoy the Chinese, human rights, you can imagine, play a very marginal role. Human rights do not show up at all. And I think that applies to both the United States right now and also the countries of the European Union. And this is a very sad state of affairs, but that is the geopolitical situation today. And I'm sorry that I can't end my talk on a more optimistic note either. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Oh, okay. Now I would like to ask Antonio Stango to have his speech. You're welcome.
So thank you very much for inviting me. It is a particular honor for me. It is not easy to be a member of the experts called the International Human Rights Community, but it gives also many privileges. I used to be active in human rights since when I was a student, like most of you today here, and I never stopped. To put together civil society, students, academia, institutions, both national and international institutions, is key to hope to make a difference in the international defense of human rights. There was an Italian poet at the beginning of the 19th century, Ugo Foscolo. He was living in the same time of Chopin, speaking in Poland, is important to remind, who happened to be refugees. You know, there were refugees along the centuries, not only nowadays. And in one of his poems, he used the expression, the alternating omnipotence of human fate. Well, this alternating omnipotence of human fate made in the last few years Rzeszów at the center of a very important flow in 2 directions. From Ukraine, from the invaded, aggressed Ukraine to the West, to the European Union, a mass of refugees, of people looking for the due international extraordinary protection, and from West to Ukraine of aid of different kinds, humanitarian aid, military aid, and other forms of support. Among the forms of support, there is also discussing the issue, the most crucial issues of this very particular, very delicate situation. And I was assigned today the role of speaking about a very touching war crime that has been committed already in the last 12 years, and it is continuing in Ukraine by the Russian occupation forces. And it is the war crime of deportation of children and of reducing children, minors in general, in a situation where they cannot enjoy the full development of their personality. They are separated from their family, they are denied access to normal education, they are forced even to renegade their roots, their national belonging, even their language, and up to the point of persuading them, forcing them even to fight against their own country. So I did on this some studies, also reporting to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean that includes more than 30 states, not only facing the Mediterranean, but also that are somehow connected, and every nation nowadays is connected with all the others, if they will or not. This report about the forced transfer of Ukrainian children starts by considering what is the international law frame. I used to teach international organization and human rights in postgraduate courses. And year after year in the last period, has been more and more difficult to start my course, to start my lesson, because there is a huge discrepancy, more and more evident, between the international theoretical frame of human rights and the praxis, what happens in the reality. And so it is extremely important. I say this first of all to the students, hoping that some of you one day will join us in the international human rights community. Is more and more important not only to study, to know perfectly the international human rights theory, but also to go and understand on the field what is really happening. And again, do our best to try and make the difference. So there is, starting from the illegal annexation of Crimea and of some part of eastern Ukraine back in 1914, we could define in international law the crime of aggression. You know, the International Criminal Court, because of its statute, cannot judge the crime of aggression if supposed to be committed by a head of state, for instance, Mr. Putin, but can discuss and judge the crimes against humanity, the war crimes, and genocide. And so in March 2023, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant, arrest warrant, for both Mr. Putin and the responsible of let's say, the responsible of the rights of children. Paradoxically enough, the Commissioner for Children's Rights in the office of the President of the Russian Federation, Madam Maria Lvova-Bielova, for allegedly being responsible for the war crimes of unlawful deportation of population, children, and of unlawful transfer of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation, under the proper articles of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So these crimes were allegedly committed in Ukrainian occupied territory at least from 24 February 2022. So from the very beginning of the large-scale invasion. But again, I would like to remind that this kind of crimes, as well as others, have been committed at least from March 2014. And by the way, I always like to remind myself that among my many privileges, let's say, there was to know from inside both the development in Russia and in Ukraine during many years. And I was in Kiev during the so-called Euromaidan. And I know, and I saw with my eyes what really was happening. So all the narrative that is propagated from Moscow, distributed to many Western channel of information that I would rather call channel of disinformation, part of many aspects to start to call the cognitive war. Well, all what they try to say about the fact that in Ukraine would have happened, according to them, a coup d'etat, and there is there, according to their narrative, a Nazi regime, and so on, is obviously completely faked. And this is really some war that we all should make ourselves ready to fight. The war against the disinformation, the war against the cognitive war that from those authoritarian regimes that have been mentioned by my colleague a few minutes ago, they continue to perform. So there is a whole frame of international law that theoretically protects in particular the children. So I would like to mention, so the the UN Convention on the Rights of Child of 1989, and then the Geneva Convention of 1951 for the protection of civil people during the conflict. Then I would say that Article 28 and 29 on the UN Convention on Child Rights provide that the state parties, and the Russian Federation is a state party of that convention, must recognize the right of the child to education and to ensure that education fosters respect for the cultural identity, language, and values of the child countries of origin. All this is completely not cared about by the Russian occupying forces. And what is the number of minors that have been deported either from Ukraine to the territory of Russian Federation or from one part of another of Ukraine in the occupied territory? It is a matter of tens of thousands of minors. The numbers are not completely sure because in some cases the information have not been properly provided. What have been demonstrated with enough support of evidence is that over 19,500 Ukrainian children have been abducted since the start of the full-range invasion, full-scale invasion. And this is only about the children whose information are available and controlled. Out of them, only about 2,000 have been brought back in Ukraine, thanks to the initiative of Ukraine State Institution, international community. There is an important report also of some United Nations commission about this and so on. But the problem is that there is what has been called a systemic nature of this deportation in order by the Russian Federation to affirm the idea of ethnic, cultural, historical unicity of the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. So that's why the children that have been deported or simply kidnapped somehow are forced to a system of pretended education. So they have to implement the Russian curriculum, and we know that the Russian curriculum in the schools is more and more far from the reality of history, for instance, because there is the unique book that must be decided from the top of the Putin regime and imposed to the school. And they sometimes even with physical violence, children are forced to attend also pre-military courses and so on, to sing the Russian anthem, etc. It is so impossible for deported children to conclude their normal Ukrainian curriculum, And usually they cannot have contact with their original family. More, for those children whose parents have been killed, or those children who have been removed from their families without any contact, there is also the forced adoption. So there have been hundreds of cases of Ukrainian children given into adoption of Russian families without, of course, consensus, neither of their own parents nor of the children themselves. And so we can go on this, because the so-called Russian spiritual and moral goals, and we are speaking now about the ethical state with an ethic based on what we cannot accept as values. They are simply the pillars of an authoritarian dictatorial regime, and these so-called Russian values have been imposed in many ways. The number of children that have been relocated to Russian camps, according to a report of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, is about 20,000. Then there is another way to try and Russify the Ukrainian children, to impose the Russian citizenship. So, we know that international law states that nobody can be deprived of one's own original citizenship, nor a citizenship can be imposed on somebody. Well, this instead has been happening as reported. Being a Russian citizen means also to be forced into military service, and you can imagine. I want to say a few words about this. There are Ukrainian children, and we are speaking again about tens of thousands, that have been involved in UNARMIA. UNARMIA is an organization that prepares the youth for the army. They are thought to honor the heroes of the special military operation, because we know that after now more than 4 years, the official denomination in Russia of the war of aggression and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is special military operation. And this is, again, something that we should keep well in mind. This applies also to China, for instance. This applies to Iran. I mean, there are several regimes that not only enforce every time is possible the military operation, it means a war in this case, not only they enact a disinformation campaign and what I called the war on information, a hybrid war, but they arrive to the point to transform, even for their own citizens, the real into fake. So to create myths, to forbid expressly to say what really happens in the world. We know that in Russia already since several years, if somebody dares to call the war, the pain is up to 15 years of prison. Just because somebody says it is a war. But what else if not a war it is? So when the world is in such a situation where international human rights frame is not taking into care by aggressive regimes to this extent, where the international theoretical system of protection of human rights cannot work. We are watching, we are witnesses of serious crisis of the UN system. I used to attend the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, as well as other important international instances. And unfortunately, they are more and more dominated by the narrative of authoritarian regimes. We all know that the only international institution that is legally authorized by the UN to order a military intervention to stop a war, to impose peace, to stop, for instance, a genocide, is the UN Security Council. In the UN Security Council, you know, there are 15 members, 5 of them are permanent and have the right, the power of veto until the Beijing regime and the Moscow regime will exert their veto power. It will be impossible to have a serious coercive power of the United Nations to impose peace, to impose the respect of human rights. Still, and I conclude, the existence of the international frame, the existence of the UN organization and all what we call the UN family is something that we have to use. It could be better, it must be better, but at least until there is this, we have to use this. And I conclude with an appeal to work together, civil society, academia, international, national institutions, to try to make a difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask Mrs. Babi Troutledge to have hers. Yes. So the title of the speech is Deputy Representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Poland. Can we have a pilot, please? Christian, can we have a pilot? Yes.
Right, let's see, does this work? Yes. All right, let's see if we can add some hopeful words to some of the presentations that we've had before as well, and see if we can draw from some of those warnings as well and add a tiny glimmer of hope maybe to the discussion. We'll try. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Babi Troutledge. I work at the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and I'm honored to be here today. So thank you so much to the university for the invitation. I'd like to take this opportunity today to speak with you about the 75th anniversary of the Refugee Convention, which is taking place this year, next month, on July 28th. But the anniversary comes at a precarious time. Having listened to the previous speakers, you know that there is a crisis of multilateralism. There is a crisis in terms of democracy, human rights at a broad scale in the world. And the anniversary also comes at a precarious time in terms of discussions about the convention's relevance, about its validity, with many states questioning whether this convention that was signed in 1959, you can see the signing, the picture behind me here, whether it still holds in the modern world. And it's an interesting discussion that we very much as UNHCR are having and encouraging different member states, but also universities, academia to have, because it's an important one. The Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol remain a cornerstone of international protection. And the convention really rose from the ashes of World War II, the ashes of Poland as well. And 75 years later, this promise was made, a promise that we argue is still relevant today.
the instruments, so the convention and its protocol, guarantee that people fleeing for their lives and seeking safety will not be returned to danger. And these instruments have saved millions of lives worldwide and continue to save millions of lives worldwide to this day. And over the decades, this global framework of law has proven adaptable and resilient. Regional instruments have bolstered it, have strengthened it in the face of new challenges and both small and large movements of people across borders. And if you allow me, I'd like to take you through a few examples of where the Refugee Convention has been really important throughout the decades. So I'll take you through some pictures if I can. So this slide, so the signing, like I said, of the convention, our predecessor, so the IRO, the International Refugee Organization, helped 1 million people in 1951 to relocate from camps in Austria, Italy, Germany, to the United States, for example. That's 1 million people in 1951. We always think about migration and asylum. I think the previous speaker mentioned this as well, being a modern day phenomenon for some reason. I'm here to show you that that's not the case. And we've seen large-scale movements and small-scale movements of people across the world, across the decades. Let's see. Not yet. Technical support, please. Yeah, I'll let you know, and then you. Sure. Yes. So this. Thank you. Thanks so much. So the Refugee Convention was there in this picture in 1956. During the Hungarian crisis, when these 3 women, shown in this picture, and a child, arrived at Eisenstadt camp in Austria, carrying all of their belongings. You can actually see all of their belongings in this picture. And at the time that this picture was taken, 125,000 refugees from Hungary had taken refuge in Austria. Now, if we go to the next slide, the Refugee Convention was there as well in 1978 in Malaysia, when Vietnamese refugees started to arrive after the fall of Saigon. And in spite of the dangers of unfriendly waters and piracy, tens of thousands risked their lives on the South China Sea. And the individuals in this picture were part of a group of 162 refugees whose small boat sank just a few meters from the shore of Malaysia. And these pictures maybe remind you of more recent images of refugees arriving on the Mediterranean after crossing the Mediterranean Sea. History, sadly, has a tendency to repeat itself. The Refugee Convention was there, as we see in the next picture, in Serbia in 1995, when refugees from Bosnia arrived there and took refuges and were provided shelter in this sports camp, this sports center shown in the picture. The Refugee Convention was there in 1997 when this Rwandan boy in the picture was provided with safety and shelter in the DRC. The Refugee Convention was there in 2014 when, as you can see in the next slide, Syrian Kurdish refugees crossed the border into Turkey from Syria near the town of Kobani, like 130,000 others. The Refugee Convention was there in 2017 when Rohingya refugees crossed the Naf River from Myanmar into Bangladesh to reach refugee camps. And in this next slide, in the picture, you'll see a group of people who 3 weeks earlier had been forced from their homes and were stranded on the Naf River shore in between Myanmar and Bangladesh. And the refugees in this picture built makeshift rafts from jerry cans and poles to try to cross the river to safety. And finally, and maybe will resonate with all of you, the Refugee Convention was there in this next slide in 2022, when families from Ukraine sought safety in Europe. And in this picture, we see a Ukrainian mother carrying her child across the border in Hungary. But these images will remind you of what happened just a few kilometers away from here at Medica border crossing point. And this refugee fled Ukraine, leaving her husband behind, together with her toddler and her newborn, seeking protection under the Temporary Protection Directive. So not so far from where we sit, history was taking place, and of course is still very much taking place today. Now, weakening or reopening the convention will not stop people fleeing danger. That much is true. It will only increase risks and potential uncertainty. What needs to instead be adapted are the processes, the systems, the procedures which enforce and complement the Refugee Convention. And we may have forgotten this over all of these years and all of the political debates and discussions, but the convention was actually designed to respect sovereignty, state sovereignty and security, helping states to manage arrivals of refugees and people in need of protection. And really what I would like to emphasize to you today, that the urgent task is today is to fully and fairly implement the convention in spite of all of the narrative, all of the insecurity around it, to protect refugees, support host countries and communities, and to manage borders in a way that's responsible and safe. And to some of you in this room, that may sound overly idealistic. It's true. We can't deny the pressure on systems, on national asylum systems in particular, the sheer rise of the number of refugees across the world, but also the number of migrants seeking to use asylum procedures for economic opportunities. And without swift identification, without processes in place and dignified return, this pressure will remain on member states and on national asylum systems. Approximately 70% of refugees worldwide seek asylum in the neighboring state. So actually most refugees will stay in the area of their country of origin. And we always forget this, especially from a European perspective, when we talk about onwards movement, when we talk about people seeking safety in Europe. So it's important to remember this in the backdrop. But under-resourcing and like I said, the pressure on systems in countries in the region spur people to find opportunities and safety elsewhere. So while they may have been originally safe in one country, that may not last, the security may not last, and they might seek opportunities elsewhere. The problem is that the Refugee Convention doesn't allow you necessarily to seek protection anywhere, right? Anywhere in the world. What it does guarantee, very importantly, is that that protection is durable, that it's sustainable, and that it helps keep you safe. And that is why UNHCR has a resettlement program, for example. And I'd like to share with you the story of my friend Armin, who fled Syria in 2012, fled into Jordan, and while he was originally safe due to his sexual orientation, he couldn't stay there. And he was supported by UNHCR to be resettled to the Netherlands at that time to build his life in safety. Dismantling asylum, dismantling international protection, and the convention that protects it will not help solve these problems, right? The pressure on the systems. It would actually deny life-saving protection. Like I said, and as we've seen in the pictures, the life-saving protection that has saved so many over the decades. It would fuel chaos at the borders and drive probably irregular movements more. It would hand more power to traffickers and smugglers, undermining the very protections it was built to guarantee and to safeguard state sovereignty and security. So what can we do to bolster these systems without doing away with the Refugee Convention, without binning it entirely? And there is actually a lot we can do, and we are very much having these discussions now and really sitting down with states to discuss how can we do this in practice. And the real solution really is to strengthen asylum systems, so asylum procedures, so they work as they were intended to do, by tackling things like congestion and backlogs and bottlenecks, by identifying false claims and ensuring that governments can restore public trust in a system that is meant to deliver protection where it is needed most. So asylum systems, in essence, need to be simplified. They need to be strengthened. They need to be resourced. I think that's an important part of the discussion as well. There needs to be funding, of course, to do this, and streamlined so that decisions are made fairly and quickly. Fast-track processes need to also, while at the same time identifying those who are in need of protection, the very obvious cases, need to also be able to identify the obvious cases where someone may not be in need of international protection and who may need a different form of legal status, but who should not be taking the place of a refugee within the system. And for that, safe pathways need to be expanded. So there need to be more safe and legal routes for individuals who are seeking economic opportunities to help find those, so they will not have to rely on dangerous journeys and accessing asylum systems that are already overburdened. And there also need to be more safe and legal routes for refugees themselves. Like I mentioned, resettlement is an important one of those. But most importantly, I think major refugee hosting countries, Poland is one of them, need support, and also those in countries neighboring countries at conflict, right? Think about those countries around Syria at the time in 2012, Turkey taking on a vast number of refugees at the time. Those are countries that need support so that refugees can find safety, and that durable and sustainable safety in those countries, and do not need to take dangerous journeys onward in order to find that safety. And these are just, some of the solutions, just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot to explore and discuss when it comes to solutions. And if you have questions about that, please feel free to approach me. I'd love to brainstorm with you. But I ask of you today, instead of questioning the validity and the relevance of an international convention that has protected people forced to flee for 75 years thus far, and still provides life-saving support and guarantees to rights, like the principle of non-refoulement, the principle that you should not be sent back to a country where you face danger, where you may be persecuted because of your gender identity, where you may be shot because of your political persuasions. The question instead is, how can we build on this legal framework, help bolster and strengthen it through processes and systems that complement it and which work in practice? And that's the important part. They need to work in practice to solve the modern challenges with which we're faced. I think the Temporary Protection Directive and how we see it in practice in Europe is a very good example. It's easy to say that it's distinguishable from international protection and its legal frameworks, but in fact, temporary protection is a pragmatic tool that really complements the broader international refugee protection regime. It can serve as a critical mechanism to ensure that gaps are addressed in national systems and capacities, especially during times of mass influx like we saw in 2022. So I hope to have given you something to think about, some food for thought, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And the last but not least, Masha Marocini-Zriński. The floor is yours.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. I also have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm not sure if this will work. So let me see. Okay, before we start, I would like to greet you all, and I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present here today, and to all the colleagues who have presented with me or who have presented before me. I really enjoyed your presentations. And actually, it's not easy to be a professor of theory of law and try to make your presentation more interesting to the wider public and to students. But that's why I always try to combine, as you professor said, and it's not easy, a theory with the practice and to see what are the current challenges, let's call them that way. And that's exactly what I tried to do with this presentation. So I actually questioned interpretative methods used by the European Court of Human Rights, which has long been regarded as the most developed system for court for human rights protection, and the current debates, political debates surrounding the convention system. So a little bit of theory, a little bit of political debates, and some case law of the European Court of Human Rights. So let me see first this. Unfortunately, again, is not working, so I'll have to bother you. So this presentation goes to the examines a question that has, in my opinion, became increasingly relevant during the last few years, but particularly during the last year, and that is whether the European consensus be used not only to expand convention rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, as has been the situation so far, but also to justify, as the states actually asked the court to do, the restriction on human rights protection in line with this, let's call it, consensus. So this question goes to the heart of the convention system, because the convention system has long been regarded the most developed and the most effective human rights protection system. And one of the defining features of the system is the interpretation of the convention in line with the current day conditions, the so-called use of the living instrument doctrine. However, during this last year, and particularly following, and I will say a few words about that, the well-known letter of 9 states that was followed by the joint statement of 27 states, and it all wrapped around the Chisinau Declaration that was adopted less than a month ago, so on 15th May this year. And these all issues revolve around the issues of migrations, and that is in particular when it comes to the European Court of Human Rights article and the Convention Articles 3 and Article 8 of the Convention. And therefore, these are the key points that will be presented today: the Convention as a living instrument, the consensus, the letter of 9, the joint statement, the Chisinau Declaration. And I will try to finish the presentation with answering the question, so can this consensus required or adopted among states lead to diminishing the human rights protection, or is the court, let's call it, safe in its decision making? Let me first say a few words about in the next slide, about the interpretive methods and principles that the court uses, but I will not speak a lot about them. The convention itself is a document from that is now 76 years old. And for that reasons, it was necessary to interpret the European Convention on Human Rights, and that is what the court does. The convention itself has no rules on how it should be interpreted, so the court always followed used the interpretative methods from the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and those methods are here: the textual, teleological, subjective, and systemic. But for us are the most, or for this presentation is the most relevant, the so-called consensual or comparative method of interpretation, the only one that is not in the Vienna Convention but developed by the court itself and also the EU court, and the principles that the European Court of Human Rights developed, and those are, as you can see them, the living instrument, the principle of effectiveness, subsidiarity, and the principle of autonomous interpretation. But among these, the living instrument plays a central role and has a central position. What the living instrument doctrine and the principle means is that the convention must be interpreted in line with the current day conditions.
The application of this principle of interpretation actually started with Article 3, so prohibition of torture, inhuman and degrading treatment in 1978, and has been applied since by the European Court of Human Rights, and has been regarded as legitimate, particularly when supported with the European consensus. So when consensus has been established among states on certain issue, and the court uses the living instrument doctrine, it has been considered legitimate. When it comes to the consensus, therefore, it has been so far operated as a mechanism for expanding and raising human rights standards. It actually represents interpretation where the judge in question uses different materials to find the meaning of a special provision or to find whether there is a consensus among states regarding certain questionable issues. And if this consensus can be found, the court will adopt the interpretation in line with this consensus. This is particularly important, as I said, to Articles 3 and 8 of the Convention, which are relevant for migration issues, because things like healthcare conditions, detention conditions, and also situation where the applicants invoke that they will be, if returned to the country of their origin, they will be subjected to violation of Article 3. Those all issues has been developed and growth through Article 3 of the Convention, and also under Article 8, the court has broadened the notions of private life, family life, and has constantly been emphasizing that the states have positive obligations and they must obey by them if they want to protect human rights. So we can move to the next slide because we're coming to this current situation, and all these developments that have been happening so far actually created an increasing political resistance among states, Council of Europe states, what some states perceive as overly expansive interpretation of the Convention. And this all started in May 2025, and it was, I must say, there have been a lot of states' resistance towards some court's interpretation, but never this open, and never there was a letter of 9 European states who claimed actually that they are calling for a new and open-minded conversation about how the court interprets the Convention. What they actually said, and I quote, "There is a need to look how the court has developed its interpretation of the Convention and whether it has in some cases extended the scope of the Convention too far as compared with the original intentions behind the Convention, thus shifting the balance between the interests which should be protected." And they believe that, in their opinion, the court has, in some cases, and they are referring to the migration cases, limited our ability to make political decisions in our own democracies. The later statement, joint statement of 27 states went even further. So the statement called for, regarding Article 3, clarity about inhuman and degrading treatment. Actually, they argued that the concept of inhuman and degrading treatment should be constrained to the most serious cases and not to prevent, so as not to prevent expulsions or extraditions of foreign criminals, and invoking proportionality, and proportionality can never be invoked when Article 3 is applied. Regarding Article 8, they emphasize the need for greater flexibility in migration-related decision-making and for stronger consideration of the public interest. Because of those two political statements, the Chisinau Declaration was long awaited, and it was adopted on 15th May. And actually, first I have what the Chisinau Declaration did not do. And unlike the letter of 9, it does not note that the state should have more room nationally to decide on when to expel criminal foreign nationals. And as to the statement of 27, it does not reiterate the particularly, I might say, problematic parts of it, including the need to rebalance the interpretation of Article 8 and to constrain the scope of Article 3 of the Convention. What the declaration does state, it does state that, that inherent in the whole Convention is a search for a fair balance between the demands of a general interest of the community and the requirements of the protection of the individual's fundamental rights. It does have some problematic points, but I will not focus on them because it basically, it was adopted by all 46 member states, and you can see that the states are not, let's say, so invasive on the court, and that the situation has calmed down within this last year. It does actually emphasizes, and that was the point of what the state really wanted, the margin of appreciation that is attributed to states, that the court is not court of fourth instance, that states have the undeniable sovereign right to decide on control migration, and the fundamental duty to make everyone feel safe within their national territory. So all these declarations focus on migration. The first two are a reaction from first 9 states, then 27 states. But finally, the consensus was among all 46 member states not to adopt, let's call it so, on migration, this approach that requires the court to stop with the interpretation that it is doing and with the protection that it's doing. But again, it's emphasizing, we have the margin of appreciation to decide what is going on within our territory. The court is not the court of fourth instance, and the principle of subsidiarity is extremely important. So, but in order to understand these reactions from the state, I want to say a few words on the European Court of Human Rights case law on migration, because based on those statements, one might think that the European Court of Human Rights, like it does, for example, with the issues surrounding the environment today, is really taking this activist approach in human rights protection. But let's first see some general principles that the court constantly emphasizes within its case law, and that is that the contracting states have the right to control the entry, residence, or removal of aliens in accordance with the rules and principles of international law and subject to their treaty obligations, and that the right to asylum is not provided for either in the convention or any of its protocols, and the court does not itself examine an actual asylum application or verify how state has honored its obligation under the 1951 Refugee Convention. So, as I said, the main issues revolve around Articles 3 and 8 of the Convention, and as you can see, I mentioned them already. Article 3 contains an absolute prohibition. It's important because they are structurally different, just to say what's the structural difference among those two articles. So Article 3 is an absolute prohibition. It can never be derogated. There is no second paragraph. The states can never, even in times of war or any crisis, say that we are derogating Article 3 rights, while on the other hand, Article 8 contains the right to private and family life, and it can always be derogated when the criteria for derogation are satisfied. So when it's necessary, when it's in accordance with the law, when it follows a legitimate aim like public safety, and when it's necessary in democratic society and proportionate. So what is the case law? I don't have particular cases, but I have some general conclusions on the court's case law regarding Article 3 and 8. And as you will see, the court actually regarding Article 3 and migration cases, so they might arise when migrants allege that they will face a real risk of torture if or inhuman and degrading treatment if they are removed to another state because they would face such treatment there. If that is the situation, the court will find a violation of Article 3 and prohibit their removal to that state. However, even if there is a real risk of that, if the state obtains assurances from that state where the risk is threatened, the court will not find a violation of Article 3 after obtaining that assurances. And also, and that has become extremely important during the last few years, if the domestic authorities, in particular the court, carried a rigorous assessment whether that individual would face a real risk of inhuman degrading treatment, the court will usually not find that the removal would breach Article 3. So the decisive factor is not the abstract situation alone, but whether the domestic authorities have assessed the risk. So we have, for example, 2 cases against France, where one case where the court found a violation of Article 3, and in another one it found the case actually inadmissible, so not even a violation, but inadmissible, concerning 2 Russian nationals of Chechen origin, and the situation was quite similar, the abstract situation, but they're individual. In one case, national courts of France actually carried the risk assessment, and the court found the case inadmissible. And in another one, national courts, the French courts, haven't done that assessment, and the court found a violation of Article 3. So it was about that individual risk assessment. When it comes to Article 8, the situation is even more, let's say, the court is more reluctant to find the violation. In most of the relevant cases, the applicants would actually argue that if they are returned, their family and private ties would break. And in recent cases, the court has emphasized that, again, if the domestic courts have carefully examined the applicant's situation, the court, and applied the Convention's case law and the court's principles, the court will not find or substitute the national, so that's returning to the margin of appreciation, the national assessment with its own assessment, and it will usually not find a violation of Article 3. So the majority of such cases have been declared inadmissible. The only thing that the court is looking is whether there are very serious reasons for it to find a violation. But those really need to be serious reasons shown by the applicant. So here again, we have some cases, a few cases where the court found a violation. So if it's whether it was someone who committed a crime as a juvenile, or someone who has lived all its youth in that state, and now they're trying to expel that applicant from the state while he committed the crime as a juvenile or has no other family ties with its country of origin. And actually, in this regard, I must mention one of the case that actually was one of the most recent one from February this year. It's VN, so they're all initials, so it's hard to remember them, and others against Sweden, where the court actually blanketly accepted what Sweden said regarding the applicant being a threat to national security and order. And the applicant was someone who committed a crime in Azerbaijan over 10, 15 years ago, and who wanted only a temporary permit to stay with his dying wife. So it was just a temporary permit to stay, but the Swedish authority said, no, he's a threat to our security because he committed the crime in Azerbaijan years ago. And the court basically accepted what Swedish courts said because they did the risk assessment. They satisfied all the criteria that the court is looking. So basically, the court will usually find that the measure of expulsion is necessary and proportionate if the national courts did so. So this demonstrates that subsidiarity, shared responsibility actually play an important role in the court's case law. So the living instrument doctrine so far may continue to operating in an expansive direction, but subsidiary and consensus shape how rights are applied in practice. So the most problematic point from consensus and the living instrument issue is the application of the rights and not the doctrinal understanding of those rights. And I also have some, before final PowerPoint and conclusion, just some statistical data. We just discussed that before the presentation, and it's interesting to hear about it because only 1 to 2% of the European Court's case law, and I'm reminding you of the letter and the joint statement that the states had, only 1 to 2% of the court's case law is regarding migration. And out of those 1 to 2%, only 6% of that case law is where the European Court of Human Rights finds a violation. So we can say that the European Court of Human Rights actually already applies a quite restrictive approach to migration cases, particularly when looked from other human rights documents and convention and bodies. So it is rather restrictive. The Chisinau Declaration is politically much more moderate than those two previous statements. So it does not look like Articles 3 and 8 will be interpreted more restrictively. However, as we have seen, it is interpreted rather restrictively, despite what the states in their political declarations says. So, to conclude, it does not look that the analysis of Articles 3 and 8, that formal narrowing of those rights is unlikely. Article 3 will remain absolute in nature, but always contextual, while the fundamental principles governing Article 8 is already established in the court's case law. And this is the last PowerPoint. The recent case law actually demonstrates an increasing emphasis on subsidiarity, margin of appreciation, and the quality of domestic judicial assessment. And rather than revising the substantive content of convention rights, the court may show great deference to national authorities when they have conducted careful, as I said, and convention-compliant assessment of individual rights. And therefore, the consensus may affect the intensity of review and the application of rights in concrete cases, but it cannot serve as a basis for undermining the core guarantees under the Convention. Because to allow consensus to justify a reduction of fundamental rights protection would be actually very difficult to reconcile with the very purpose of the Convention as a living instrument designed to secure effective and practical human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all speeches. It was very interesting. I hope you enjoyed also. So now we have time for discussion and for asking the questions. So would anyone want to ask the question? There, Christiana. Can you just introduce yourself and for a moment, okay, wait for microphone and of course ask the questions.
My name is Natalia Nechaeva-Yurichuk, Yuri Fedkovich, Chernivtsi National University, Ukraine. Thank you very much for inviting and for possibility to be here. Thank you, organizers, for such really great event. And to all speakers for your insights and inputs about the contemporary situation. So all of us understand that we are in crisis right now, and you were talking, my question is mainly for our first speaker, to Mr. Andrew. We are all in crisis, and we all understand that Europe has to strengthen its military capacity. And my question is very simple, but probably complicated. Where and what kind of sources of this capacity and strength of European military architecture and European military security do you see? So where have Europe to take these sources?
Thank you very much. Look, there is no substitute for capacity. There is no substitute in just making decisions in, allocating euros or dollars to produce equipment, munitions, to raise the kind of reserves that you need. Ukrainians cannot shoot euros. They need missiles, they need shells and whatnot. The same thing goes for sensors and for high-end enablers. Quite frankly, without the US logistical chain, your country would not have been supplied. I mean, that's the level of hollowing out of the European capabilities that we have today. Your country has, without question, the strongest military now in all of Europe. I'm not including the United States military into it. But what's in the European theater, because our presence here is shrinking and will continue to shrink. What it requires is leadership. Several years ago, when I was still working in Germany for the US Defense Department, I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal where I argued that when it comes to China and Russia, there's what I call the crisis of disbelief among European leaders. And I hope I'm not offending anyone, but fat times don't produce leaders, they produce managers. And it's very hard for those people who've been rolling in butter for 30 years to actually ask the citizenry to commit resources, to mobilize, to build up resilience. I'll give you an example. I'm a great fan of Finland. It's a very small nation, 5.6 million people. Everybody serves in the military from the age of 18 to 60. Trust in government is off the charts. When the Finns were getting ready to join the alliance, the leadership was sufficient to move them in that direction, okay? Finland has the largest conventional artillery of all of the European militaries. And most of all, that unity and that sense of purpose and really citizenship, and I keep talking about this over and over again because in the Western democratic world, we've devolved the idea of citizenship into essentially a set of rights and privileges. And we forgot the Madisonian ideal that to be a citizen means also obligations, means also responsibility for others, your extended family, if you will, for the nation. Europe is grappling with several problems right now. One of them is migration. You know, you've heard a lot about protecting the rights of displaced persons. Last year, UN, if I remember correctly, reported there were about 308 million people who are on the move all across. Of those forcible migrants, people who were expelled, war refugees, 1/3, 1.8. So the migration problem is not the problem just of the kind of violence you see in different theaters. We have talked ourselves into believing in the US, you know, into some slogans that do not connect to reality. We keep repeating to our students, diversity is our strength. It is not. You have to create a sense of shared citizenship and obligations, otherwise you balkanize your society. 4 years during the Biden administration, we had 21 million people cross the southern border. Let it sink in, 21 million people. And it was a smuggling operation. You know, the smugglers would organize planes out of Istanbul to Mexico City, the caravan would form and would march. The United States lives on immigration. I mean, the nation is built by acculturating and bringing in immigration. But it also has a core culture into which these people have to be brought. And if you don't do that, I arrived in Germany in 2016, apologize for the long answer, just as the wave was crusting, Wir schaffen das, you remember, Klaus, right? The things that were happening in Europe at that time. And I lived in a small Bavarian community where our base was, and I remember the shock to the system. You have to reconnect when it comes to rearmament, managing migration. You have to reconnect with the citizenry. You cannot throw 25 to 30% of your citizens outside the fence and say, you're a bunch of populists, I'm not going to talk to you, because then you get AfD in Germany. Compromise is mother's milk of democracy. You need to engage with your citizenry. And the problem that I see is I hear a lot of rhetoric. I hear, one last comment, the European economy is dying. You used to be 30% of the global GDP, you are now 17%. If those trends continue, you will be 10% by 2050. The United States, since the beginning of the 20th century, is 25% of global GDP. This is remarkable. We're only 5% of the global population. Why are you dying? You're overregulated. Your industrial energy costs 4 times of what it costs us in the US, not to mention the Chinese. And I greatly enjoy visiting Europe. I drink delicious latte, you know, drive on roads that are actually not pothole like back in the US. But if you want to become a museum, you missed out on AI, you missed out on quantum computing. Your R&D investments at the state level are completely skewed. I'm not talking about Ukraine because you're at war. You're a very different country. But what I see, you know, what I see in Europe, I spent 12 years in Germany, was watching this up close. So leadership. It takes people who tell the nations the truth, tell them there's no free lunch. It's going to cost money to rebuild your military, okay? The German government treated the defense budget like a piggy bank for all sorts of social spending. Since Gutenberg all the way through von der Leyen, that's how it operated. And the consequences are what you see. that if the United States pulls out of Europe, you do not have the capacity to deter Russia. You simply don't. So my plea to, I see a lot of young people, unfortunately some of them decided to leave, but I'm speaking to young people, get into politics, take responsibility for your country. I mean, my country is governed by geriatrics. I mean, Joe Biden was 83. On the 14th of June, Donald Trump will be 80. Joe Biden was 83, think about it. The gentleman didn't know which way was up or down or left or right. He had Parkinson's, he had dementia. Now we know he had stage 4 prostate cancer. Everybody was lying, the media, the elites. Oh, Joe's so switched on, you know, blah. I can tell you that underneath the House of Representatives in the US, there is a tract where some of the congressmen and senators are wheeled in before they walk onto the floor. Why are baby boomers still running the country? Look at Poland. Why is the solidarity generation still setting your agenda? You have a young generation that grew up in freedom, untainted by communism. Take responsibility for your country. That's leadership. But you've got to tell people the truth. I have a friend who is an English journalist. He said, politicians know what needs to be done. The problem is that if they do what needs to be done, then they don't know how to get reelected. And that's why you have this situation that you see today. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a slightly different tack, but not totally. I think to give some credit to the Trump administration, then I would agree that the pressure on the Europeans to increase their defense budget was long overdue, has been attempted by many other presidents before Trump, but Trump probably is more ruthless, more brutal in making clear to the Europeans they do need to increase their defense budgets. And then Putin and the Ukraine war, of course, contributed to that as well. And I think that was long overdue, was a good idea. However, when we then look what else did the Trump administration do, and they actively have undermined transatlantic solidarity, you know, imposing tariffs on your best allies in the world, including also Japan and South Korea and many others, and not tariffs at a moderate level, but initially at least at a very high level. Same on China and other countries you would regard as your enemies or foes. This is crazy. This does nothing do for transatlantic solidarity and unity. When we then talk about all that talk coming out of Washington, Hexas and Vance in particular, about the civilizational danger Europe is in, that Western civilization is going down the drain, and of course Hexas and Vance, they know what civilization is supposed to mean. This is totally crazy. This is far right wing. That is what the German AfD tells us, and Hexas and Vance say the same. This does nothing for transatlantic unity and solidarity. And we should also remember that the United States benefits an awful lot from having troops in Europe, from using the Landau Hospital, the Ramstein Air Base for their exposure of power into the Middle East and elsewhere. So it is not just that the Europeans benefit from the United States, though they do, of course, but the United States also benefits a lot from their allies and their bases in Europe and elsewhere. And that is, of course, conveniently overlooked by the current administration in DC. And then the last point, I agree, we really have to make an effort regarding AI and other developing technologies. But shouldn't the transatlantic allies not do that together? You know, if the Europeans and the Americans try to develop high-notch AI technologies, we may or may not succeed. If we do it together, the likelihood of success and confronting countries like China in their development is much, much higher. So I would appeal for transatlantic union and solidarity and seeing what we actually have in common, rather trying to go actively about undermining the transatlantic alliance. And the current administration in the United States, unlike any other government in the United States, is really setting out to destroy the transatlantic alliance and not to try to improve it by putting pressure on them to increase the defense effort, and then to develop it into a much better coherent solidarity association. And I think that is really what is needed. We need to stick together rather than allow ourselves to be divided by ourselves. Thank you.
I have to answer this.
Okay, 2 minutes.
You know what's funny? Every time I come to Europe, it takes 5 minutes before I start hitting Trump, 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 Trump. Relax, Klaus. You don't have a relationship with this or that president, this or that political party. You've got a vital national security relationship with the United States of America. Agreed? Okay. If you get a lemon, make lemonade. Work the problem, people. We've had presidents of this orientation or that orientation. Point number 2, what's destroying the transatlantic relationship? Rude rhetoric, or for 30 years not doing your duty that you're bound by the treaty to do in terms of resourcing your military? At the Vilnius NATO summit, every single government signed on to the 3 regional plans that we have. There are capabilities, commitments attached to this. What happened? Nothing. When your chancellor gave the Zeitenwende speech, everybody was crying. I'd like some more Wende and less Zeiten, you know? I'd like for people to actually spend the money and put the money where their mouth is. It's very nice to rely for 70 or 80% of cost of European defense on the Americans, but you know what? We have roads too. My point is, now let me finish, let me finish, okay? Not so easy, my friend. Not so easy, my friend. Look, President Trump's rhetoric is extremely counterproductive. You don't insult your allies. In Afghanistan, I saw the Danes who were fighting, you know, with us, arm in arm, taking huge risks, had the highest casualties from any NATO nation if you look at the population resources. On the other hand, Greenland, since, you know, this became the kind of cause célèbre, is vital to our hemispheric defense. I will remind everybody that during the Second World War, the US Army garrisoned Greenland because Denmark could not defend it. What Trump should have done was to sit down with this very nice Danish lady, the prime minister, in the privacy of a room and say, listen, I need this and this and this and this. And I'm sure she would have given it to him. But this is the personality of the man. With all due respect, he was elected. Why? Because American elites, the bi-coastal elites from the East Coast and the West Coast, and you know it very well because you live there, ripped off the middle class to a point that it's only 50% of the total. The shrinking middle class gave a finger to the establishment, electing basically a media entertainer as their president. Why? Because he was the only guy who spoke their language. And finally, on defense spending. Look, it doesn't matter how much in percentage terms you spend on defense if 90% of that spending goes to personnel. I know an Air Force in a small country in Europe that can fly in circles around the capital. That's not an Air Force. It's a flight club. They've got nice uniforms, you know, they salute each other, et cetera, et cetera. There are requirements in NATO that the Europeans have consistently refused to meet for 30 years. And I remember Secretary Gates at the National Defense University when the new strategic concept was presented, telling, and there was all sorts of flag officers sitting there, French, German, you know, British. At the end of it, you know, Bob said, if you people, which was very rude, do not resource your military, this strategic concept is not worth paper it's written on. Have a nice day. 2 French officers sitting behind me said, the Americans BS like this all the time, but they always do what they do. The German bases, who pays for them? Who built them? Who are the contractors who are making mega bucks by servicing? I had German crews painting grass at the Marshall Center. They loved it. When we tried when the French tried to become a part of it, oh, no, 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 no. Look, Americans bring tons of money into your country in terms of that basing. Yeah, we benefit. We couldn't operate in the Middle East without those bases. But when Spain tells me who pretends to be an ally, that I am not allowed to fly my aircraft from our bases, which under SOFA agreement they're obligated to do. I'm sorry, that's not what allies do. You don't have to go to that war. But if you obstruct your ally, you are not a NATO reliable partner. That's enough of my rant.
Just briefly, if I may. Actually, I would like you to relax too, because I actually largely agree. We largely are in agreement regarding, and I gave full credit to Trump to put pressure regarding the defense budgets on the Europeans. This is absolutely right, which I also emphasize. However, of course, there is burden sharing. 50% of the bases, at least, if not more, is actually paid by the European allies. And I think what the issue is not so much the military dimension, which I think you have a point, the Trump administration has a point. This is, I think, not really in dispute. The issue is trade relations, where, of course, the Europeans create a lot of wealth in the United States. You know, to put all these tariffs on European companies is only in very rare examples actually fair. That was a highly unfair policy. It still is. Recently, we had the EU being accused of supporting forced labor. So another 15% was slapped on the European companies. This is crazy. This has nothing to do with transatlantic solidarity. It has also nothing to do with the defense sector. This is a totally different issue. This is crazy. Also, being elected by a narrow majority of Americans doesn't allow any president to be rude to its allies. Whether you get elected with 50% or 80%, you don't need to be rude. This is a matter of civilization. No, yeah, exactly. But I think the current president does undermine transatlantic solidarity. He has a point in some respects regarding defense, absolutely. He has not a case regarding trade relations, for example. You know, I think we need to differentiate on the kind of sectors and policy areas we talk about. He sometimes has a point, but in many respects, including Greenland, of which you mentioned, he has no point at all, and he is actually off the wall. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you can finish those informal conversation after the panel. I was thinking to say we're back into Europe, but I saw our friend Ryan from the Hardwick College from outside of New York, from Oneonta. He wants to ask the questions. So, can you bring him the microphone?
As a woman, I will take the.
Okay, sorry.
I asked it before him, actually.
Okay, sorry.
Latifa Chakri from Paris. I'm the president of the Amewa NGO. I would like to break this debate between the American academic gentlemen. And I'd like to ask you, the subject of this conference is International Congress on Human Rights. So what is your opinion regarding human rights when the war had been launched, for example, in Iraq? You never talk about the torture and the awful images we had through the media worldwide on the use of, for example, sarin gas and torture on citizens. The first point. The second, you never, both of you talked about energy issues on the gas and oil. So what is the indexation between human rights priorities or war for energy? Thank you.
She told me she wouldn't give me the microphone again, so I guess I'm in trouble. I am not sure what your question is about energy and war. I will just give you one example. I was in Germany when Germany was finally cutting off at least part of Russian gas. And it still shut down the 3 remaining nuclear reactors. Okay? And I was looking at this thinking, what does an aneurysm feel like? Because they're buying at the same time in Germany electricity generated by old French reactors that are just right across. Okay? If you look at what goes on in the global south in terms of mining for lithium and other components, the environmental degradation that takes place, and the batteries are produced where it takes tons of water to produce 1 ton of lithium. but nobody talks about it in the EU. You want to talk about free trade? Why do you have barriers that you have in the EU for anything but raw materials coming out of Africa? If you invest in development in Africa, Africa will not export people. If you can't develop and sell ready-made products out of there, where there's a population bulge, guess what? We could talk forever about trade deals and whether tariffs are good or not. The fact is we've been running trade deficit with Europe for decades. I don't think that's a good idea. Now, we borrow in our own currency, but our national debt right now is $40 trillion. $40 trillion. Now, unlike anybody else, we borrow in our own currency, so you can say, it doesn't really matter. It does matter. To tell me as you're insulting allies is like trying to say, and I'm against Trump hurling insults at people, whether they're allies or anybody else. He's a narcissistic man who stands out there, who at the same time has been treated by policy elite as either an accident. MAGA is about 40% of the Republican Party, but it controls the party. The Democrat Party is completely in disarray. They've gone so far left, they have no idea which way to move. So he's a product of our domestic politics, but the status quo in which Germany invests nothing in defense and benefits from American defense umbrella, so even if you pay 50% for the bases, Klaus, that's a pretty damn good deal compared to what you would have to pay if you actually maintained the Bundeswehr the way it used to be. Well, I understood the question was about the war in Iran and human rights, Iraq. Look, I was against that war. I was against the global war on terror. I have written about this for years, just like I've been arguing for hard decoupling from China. What we have right now in the Western community writ large, and it's also a part of Europe, but in the United States, you have bi-coastal elites. You've got digital aristocracy that made out like bandits in the digital revolution. We have more billionaires than we have ever had. Musk is going to be a trillionaire pretty soon. And on the East Coast, you have the financial aristocracy that made money like there's nobody's business. And we send 40% of our manufacturing, including technology transfer, to communist China. Why? Because of labor arbitrage. You could make 80, 90% more. You had this incredible pool of slave labor. The war in Iraq was absolutely a mistake. Either the intel failed or the data was not correct. And the worst thing that happened was that after the defeat of the Iraqi military, instead of doing what General Garner tried to do, which was, I'm gonna, find a guy with a big mustache, give him the keys to the safe and get the hell out of there as quickly as possible, Bremer came and he debatified. He threw out 450,000 men with guns with no income into the streets, and that's when the first American GI has been killed. So I'm not going to defend the stupidity of our policy elites, far from it. I'm very sorry this happened when I look at the devastation that's become the Middle East, but also European appeasement. I mean, with all due respect, Putin invades Georgia in 2008. What happens? Nothing. He gets a slap on the fingers and nothing happened. Nord Stream 1 is completed, right? He takes Crimea, slap on the fingers, another Minsk BS, and Nord Stream 2 is started. He butchers Syrians at Aleppo, nothing happens. I remember French and German politicians telling me, now Putin will have influence on migration flows. And finally, it took the Ukrainian people to stand up and fight and change history. Because had Zelensky taken that right and had Ukraine collapsed, guess what would happen? Isn't this awful? Human rights, this, that, and the other. And business would be going as usual. Germany went from about 35% dependence on Russian gas to close to 60% on the eve of the invasion, bypassing the transit countries, all the time talking about how this is just it was economic project, when geopolitics of this was staring you in the face. Germany would have become the biggest distributor of Russian gas in Europe, and Russia the biggest supplier of energy, bypassing flank countries which allowed Putin to put pressure on them. So I know it's easy to beat up on the United States. I think we have made a number of mistakes, but with all due respect, look in the mirror from time to time. and ask yourself why we are in this situation.
Thank you very much for answering. We have also guests from Georgia, right? That's why it's very interesting also. And the Ryan.
Hello, Ryan Sarasola, Hartwick College in New York over there. And I guess my question is actually, I didn't get your name, the United Nations, the representative. You mentioned, Andrew, a problem with, bringing refugees or diversity, an idea of that, and I thought maybe you would like to respond to that a little bit. What are the benefits for host countries that host refugees?
Great question.
Thank you.
That's a very good question. Sorry, I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Babish Routledge, Protection Officer with UNHCR. They are vast. I mean, we always talk about economic migrants when it comes to the contribution to host countries and host communities, but we often fail to look at what can asylum seekers, what can refugees do, especially when they're given the tools, the access and the rights that they need, as well as obligations. I completely take on your point, to be able to do that. And I think Ukrainians are, of course, a good example, but there's many others that I could mention. And we don't need to look far to see the benefits on host communities, but also host economies. So here in Poland, in 2024, we saw a 2.7% increase in GDP, solely down to refugees from Ukraine working in Poland and contributing to the economy. 2.7% GDP. That is huge. UNHCR did a study together with Deloitte. I'd be happy to share that with you so you can look at how that was calculated. But that is purely a contribution of refugees in Poland. And we often, as UNHCR, say there are so many benefits to welcoming refugees in countries, but we're often not able to back that up with economic data. But now we were, for the first time, able to do that. And when you look at the data, it's pretty revolutionary. So there are many benefits, aside from also all of the social benefits, of course, that come with integration, inclusion, social cohesion. But economic benefits are mostly the ones that states are most interested in. And we're very happy to say that we are able to calculate that and we are able to demonstrate that here in Poland. So thanks, it's a very good question.
Thank you. Anyone else want to ask the questions? Okay.
Thank you. I'm Maciej Milczanowski from Rzeszów University. I have a question for the last panelist, because I'm not a lawyer. I heard your speech, and what makes me wondering, as I was a soldier in Iraq, I saw all those things you mentioned. We heard about the abduction of Ukrainian children. There is no punishment for this. We can just speak how wrong is it, and how we need to change the world. And yet I read in your slide that there are absolute guarantees of the rights, of the human rights. So I would ask, where are those guarantees? Because guarantees is something which have to have a leverage. You have to have a real punishment for the breaking of the human rights. We hear, and not only we, because in Europe we understand why we write this way, but people in Africa, in the Middle East, and other regions are also reading such slides, such rules. They read that human rights are absolutely guaranteed. Who is guaranteed those rights? Where is the leverage to do that? And they are thinking, okay, these are the European human rights. And this is the discrepancy between the Western world and the rest of the world. And it shows a little bit hypocrisy of our world, let's say. But okay, that's my problem. I don't understand this law language.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. But you asked the question. You answered with the thought, and your final sentence was, "But that's law." You know, human rights are considered to be universal, but as you said, theory is one thing and practice is another thing. Unfortunately, why we keep saying for the European Convention on Human Rights that it's the most effective, because it's the only one that has a court so for all member states that can decide on violations on individual rights. That seems for us like a normal thing, but that was revolutionary when it came, because we have to bear in mind that's not a national court. It's a court that decides that a state that has willingly entered this contract, this convention, will be held responsible by an international court, by international judges, for violation of individual human rights of a certain individual. So from a legal standpoint and from a lawyer standpoint, that is huge. And of course, it's not ideal. And you cannot, because, a state can, and some states have done so, some more openly and some behind the closed doors, have said, okay, to the European Court of Human Rights, you went too far. We will simply just leave the convention and not be part of it. And what can you do then? Can you say that then human rights will be protected better? No, it will be even worse, because there will be no, at least here you have a situation, because you also have to bear in mind that once the court delivers the judgment, it is up for the state to execute that judgment. And we had numerous cases of mass violations where some states would say, we don't agree with this judgment, and what you can do. There are no guarantees, unfortunately. No, but I said that if you have human rights within this convention, and most of the human rights can be derogated in times of war, because when the convention was adopted, it was up for the Council of Europe to have as many states as possible that will ratify this convention and be bound by the court. But then you have several rights, and they're really rare, that contain absolute guarantee, which means that under no conditions can those rights be derogated. I completely understand your point, because they were derogated. You have seen derogations of those rights. You see that children are being abducted. There are human rights violations, but in times that are happening at the moment, and we heard really interesting debates of what is going on globally. It might seem little, but from perspective of individual whose human rights have been violated, and possibly that there was an international court who said, yes, your rights have been violated and the state has done you wrong, and possibly something like that will never happen again, or will not happen to someone else, it is big. So it's a matter of perspective. I completely understand your perspective, but in terms of the point of that right is that the state cannot say, we are now fighting terrorism, and so we are allowed to torture people. No, you're not. Not at any times you are not allowed. It does not mean that the state will not do it, but it means that the state, and that's the point of that Article 3, even in times of war or any other threats to nation or fight against terrorism, an individual cannot be subjected to torture, inhuman and degrading treatment. Full stop. That's what the court says. It doesn't mean that it will not happen, unfortunately. So, thank you. I completely understand your question. There are no guarantees.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Christian.
Thank you for the speakers. I'm Stephen Much from Australia. And I just wanted to ask you, to me, wars of aggression are the greatest threat to human rights. I mean, what was the United Nations set up for was to stop wars of aggression. So I'd love to know what the speakers think. 170 little girls were killed in a bombing raid in Iran. An Iranian frigate was sunk by a United States submarine with 3 Australians on board that submarine. And from press reports, I believe no effort was made to rescue survivors from that submarine. So how do we justify waging a war which could be characterized as a war of aggression against Iran, which has caused major international disruption, has caused massive civilian loss of life, including those little girls, because those who wage wars of aggression are responsible for the results of that war. And if you're a bank robber and you rob a bank and a security guard is killed in that commission of an offence, that is felony murder, if you look at domestic law. So I'd just love to know what your position is on the war against Iran that's being waged at the moment by Israel and the United States.
Are you looking at me or are you looking at
Both of the gentlemen would be interested. I'd just be interested to know your
Who
opinion.
wants to answer?
Let me.
Last one.
Yeah. In my view, the Iran war is unjustified. Is not the right way to go about it. Iran is, of course, a danger. The regime in Iran is notorious for many years. Only recently we had apparently more than 30,000 protesters killed by their own government. Any nuclear ambition of Iran, which they undoubtedly have, is dangerous, should not be allowed, clearly. So, on the other hand, the question is, can we, by bombarding Iran, achieve a better situation in Iran? And it seems to be clear that that is not the case. The regime has, in a way, changed. You know, the leadership got killed, but we have new leaders there who seem to be even more hardline, more intransigent. The nuclear ambition is has been perhaps postponed, but certainly not curtailed. So the question is, how can that war, the bombardment, bring about a better situation? And the Trump administration miscalculated, I would say. They thought they could do something like Venezuela, a quick beheading of the leadership, and then within a few days or a week, the war would be finished. They did not calculate that the Strait of Hormuz would be closed, and cause all sorts of energy problems all around the world, including, of course, to the global south, with serious implications for agriculture and other, needs. We were in the middle of negotiations when the bombarding occurred. In my view, these negotiations should have been allowed to continue to see the outcome. And the whole thing, of course, started when the first Trump administration abrogated the nuclear treaty of 2015, which the Obama administration had concluded. Trump withdrew from that, believing it was a bad deal, and now he's trying to find another deal, which essentially will be, if he succeeds, will be very similar to what already was concluded in 2015. Perhaps it will be slightly better, but I wonder. The 2015 treaty was good, relatively good, in terms of nuclear, curtailing the nuclear ambition of Iran. It was much less good regarding Iran's support for its proxies like Hezbollah and for other mischief and terrible things Iran was doing in the region. But regarding the nuclear problem, I think the 2015 treaty was not bad at all. It had a length of 15 years, something like that. It probably could have been extended beyond that if cooperation was possible. And we know that Iran stuck to the 2015 clauses regarding nuclear enrichment. They did not violate them. They only started violating these clauses after 2018, when Trump in his first term had withdrawn from the treaty. So Iran is a problem, but by bombarding it, that problem doesn't seem to be closer to a solution. Having said that, the regime is not positive, is not good, is not an underling, as it is often now portrayed in the media. It is a serious problem. Bombarding Iran, I think the government miscalculated, and it has led to a lot of global problems which we all feel, but other countries which are much poorer than we in the Western world feel it even more thoroughly than we do.
Thank you very much. So, unfortunately, it's a time to finish. Sorry, but there's gonna be opportunity to asking the question, to talk, after this panel, during the lunch, during the dinner, and so on. So I would like to thank you, all of you, for being here, especially our panelists. And I would like to invite all of you, panelists, students, academic staff, for officially photograph. It's gonna be outside of the building. We're gonna have drone, we're gonna have extra things you're gonna see. So our students will guide you and show you the way. It's outside of the building. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoy it and have a great time in Rzeszów. Thank you. Thank you.
And a round of applause for our moderator, please.
Photo here. Krzysiu, zrób